Her desperate mother of many children took a job as a cleaner in the mansion of a wealthy family. Everyone laughed when, despite being poor, she took in an old woman without a home, but what happened days later? The dawn in Seattle was always a spectacle of serenity. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains of Haley's modest home, gently illuminating the worn walls that were filled with memories. Despite the calm outside, inside the house, Haley felt a constant tightness in her chest. It was the same knot she had learned to hide since the day she lost George, her husband and life partner. George had been the pillar of the family, a man whose smile could brighten even the darkest days. He worked tirelessly to achieve the dream they both shared, opening a small shop in town that would ensure a more stable future. However, everything fell apart the day a traffic accident took him away forever. Since then, Haley had taken on the responsibility of keeping her family afloat, though the void left by George tormented her every day. That morning was no different. Haley woke up before dawn, as always, moving silently so as not to wake her children. As she prepared breakfast, her thoughts inevitably drifted towards George. She remembered how he used to enter the kitchen, giving her a gentle kiss on the cheek before helping her prepare the meal. Now the kitchen seemed larger and colder without his presence, but Haley knew she couldn't afford to give in to sadness. Her children depended on her. Will, the oldest, was the first to wake up. At 13, he had taken on a protective role towards his younger siblings. His eyes reflected a premature maturity, a result of his father's loss. He approached Haley, who with a tired yet loving smile handed him a plate of freshly toasted bread. "Good morning, Mum," Will said, trying to sound cheerful. "Good morning, my love. Did you sleep well?" Haley responded, trying to hide the weariness in her voice. Will nodded, but they both knew neither of them had truly slept well in a long time. It was as if every night the memories of George became more vivid, making them feel his absence more intensely. As the other children began to wake up, the house filled with life. The laughter and childish shouts echoed through the hallways, momentarily pushing away the sadness that hung in the air. Haley clung to those moments, those small flashes of normalcy that kept her going. After breakfast, Haley prepared to leave for work. Her cleaning uniform, though simple, was always immaculate. She knew that her job at the Johnson mansion was her only source of income, and though the tasks were exhausting, Haley took pride in doing them well. George always said that work, no matter how humble, should be done with dedication and love. Before leaving, Haley stopped at Will's room. The boy was helping his siblings get ready for school, his face serious as he gave them instructions. Haley felt a lump in her throat, seeing how much her son had grown since George's death. He had lost much of his childhood, forced to mature too quickly. "Will," Haley called softly from the doorway, "thank you for everything you do, son. I don't know what I would do without you." Will looked up, and for a moment Haley saw the same determination that had characterized George. He approached his mother and, in a gesture overflowing with love and responsibility, hugged her tightly. "We're in this together, Mom. Everything will be okay," he whispered, as if trying to convince both her and himself. Haley nodded, swallowing her tears. With one last kiss on her son's forehead, she left the house, heading toward the mansion. As she walked through the cobbled streets of the town, the weight of George's absence accompanied her, but so did the strength she had inherited from him. She knew she had to be strong, for herself and her children. Upon arriving at the mansion, Haley took a deep breath before entering. She knew the day would be long and exhausting, but she reminded herself that every sacrifice she made was for her family's well-being. With a serene face, she pushed open the heavy door of the mansion, ready to face another day. But in her heart, Haley knew that although life had been hard on her, she could always choose to be kind, as George had taught her, and that choice, though simple, gave her the strength to keep going, one day at a time. The imposing gates of the Johnson mansion slowly opened as Haley crossed the threshold, her small figure contrasting with the grandeur of the place. The mansion, with its tall stone walls and meticulously cared-for gardens, represented a world completely foreign to hers, a world where wealth seemed eternal and everyday problems non-existent. Haley walked with a determined step along the long path leading to the main entrance. Over the months, She had learned to appreciate the beauty of the place, without letting it constantly remind her of what she didn't have. The work was demanding, but it also offered her a break from the worries that awaited her at home. Here she could lose herself in the routine, cleaning and organizing, letting the external order bring her a bit of inner peace. Upon entering the mansion, the scent of fresh flowers enveloped her. The spacious rooms, decorated with antique furniture and valuable works of art, glowed under the light filtering through the windows. Haley knew that every corner had to be immaculate, and though the task was arduous, she always made sure everything shone like a mirror. However, not everyone in the mansion shared her appreciation for a job well done. Mr. Emilio, the head caretaker, was there, as always, watching everything with his sharp eyes and furrowed brow. He was a man of few words, but his presence was felt in every corner of the house. Haley respected him, but she also feared him. She knew that any small mistake would not go unnoticed by him. "Good morning, Mr. Emilio," Haley greeted with a polite smile as she adjusted her apron. "Good morning, Haley," he responded in a deep voice without even looking at her, focused on reviewing a list of tasks. Mr. Emilio was known for his rigidity. The staff whispered among themselves that nothing seemed to please him, and Haley had learned that the best way to deal with him was simply to do her job without drawing attention. As she began cleaning one of the main rooms, she could feel his gaze on her, looking for any excuse to criticize. The room with its marble fireplace and velvet curtains was a constant challenge to maintain. Every object had its exact place, and any deviation from that order could unleash Mr. Emilio's silent fury. However, Haley worked with precision, moving each piece carefully, cleaning every surface until it reflected the light. As the morning passed, Mr. Johnson appeared in the room. He was a middle-aged man with an elegant demeanor and a friendly attitude. Unlike Mr. Emilio, he always had a smile and a kind word for everyone. His family was his greatest pride, and although he possessed immense wealth, he never seemed to let that define him. "Haley," Mr. Johnson exclaimed upon seeing her. "Good morning, how are you today?" Haley quickly straightened it up, whipping her hands on her apron before responding. "Good morning, Mr. Johnson. I'm well, thank you. And you?" "I can't complain, Haley, I can't complain," he said with a soft laugh. "You know, I always admire the care you put into your work. The mansion has never been so immaculate since you joined the team." Haley felt a warm sense of comfort at her boss's words. It was a recognition she rarely received, and though she didn't work seeking praise, that small gesture of appreciation gave her the strength to continue. "Thank you, sir. I do the best I can," she responded humbly. "And it shows," he added before heading to his office, leaving Haley with a shy smile. But as soon as Mr. Johnson left, Mr. Emilio approached, his presence like a dark shadow that dimmed any light. "Don't get too comfortable, Haley," he said in a low voice, his cold eyes fixed on her. "There's no room for mistakes here. Don't forget that we're in a mansion, not a hut." Haley felt her stomach tighten, but she didn't let her emotions show on her face. She simply nodded and continued with her work, reminding herself why she was there, reminding herself that every effort was for her children, for the future that George had dreamed of for them. The day continued, and though Mr. Emilio's words weighed on her mind, Haley pushed forward, focused on her task. Each polished object, each piece of furniture arranged, was a small step towards the stability she longed for. At the end of the day, as the sun began to set behind the mountains and the mansion was enveloped in a majestic silence, Haley allowed herself a moment to look around. Everything was in order, just as it should be. Mr. Emilio had no reason to criticize her, and though exhaustion was taking over, Haley felt a deep satisfaction for having fulfilled her duty. As she gathered her things to return home, the echo of Mr. Johnson's words accompanied her, giving her a small breath of hope. In a world full of contrasts, where wealth and poverty coexisted in a delicate balance, Haley knew that although her life wasn't easy, she had the power to create her own order and beauty, even amidst chaos. And with that thought, she left the mansion, walking towards her home, where her children awaited her, and where, despite everything, she always found the true wealth of her life, the love of her family. The sun was beginning to descend on the horizon, bathing the small town of Seattle in a golden light. Haley was returning home after a long and exhausting day at the Johnson mansion. Despite the fatigue she felt in every bone, she couldn't help but smile as she approached her home. From a distance, she could hear the laughter of her children and the soft voice of Mr. Tony, her neighbor and trusted friend. Mr. Tony, an elderly man, had been an unexpected blessing in the lives of Haley and her children. Widowed for many years, he had clung to his daily routine to fill the void left by his wife. However, when Haley and her family arrived in the neighborhood, his life changed. He found in them a new reason to wake up every morning, a renewed purpose that brought back the spark to his days. Haley opened the door to her house and was greeted by a chorus of children's voices. The kids ran toward her, embracing her enthusiastically. The aroma of a simple yet comforting dinner filled the small kitchen, and at the table Mr. Tony was serving plates with a warm, wrinkled smile on his face. "Mom!" the children shouted in unison. "Look what Grandpa Tony made today!" Haley joined them around the table, momentarily leaving behind the weight of the day. She sat next to Mr. Tony, grateful for his constant and selfless presence. To her children, Mr. Tony was more than a neighbor. He had become the grandfather they never had, a paternal figure who filled, at least in part, the void left by George. "Thank you, Tony," Haley said, taking his hand affectionately. "I don't know what we would do without you." Mr. Tony smiled, his eyes full of affection. "Haley, dear, it's a pleasure for me to be here with you all. Your children are like my own grandchildren, and they brighten my days more than you can imagine." As they dined, Mr. Tony shared stories of his youth with the children, tales full of adventures and life lessons. The children listened with fascination, their faces lit up with admiration. Haley watched the scene with a heart full of gratitude. She knew that, although her life was full of challenges, she had found unwavering support in Mr. Tony, a friend willing to help without asking for anything in return. After dinner, while the children played in the living room, Mr. Tony and Haley sat on the small porch of the house, enjoying the cool evening air. The stars were beginning to appear in the sky, and the town was settling into a peaceful silence. It was in these moments of calm that Haley could open her heart and share her worries with Mr. Tony. "Today has been a difficult day," Haley confessed, her gaze lost on the horizon. "Sometimes I feel that no matter how hard I try, I'm not moving forward. The work, the debts, the children's needs. It all piles up, and I feel so alone without George." Mr. Tony listened in silence, nodding with understanding. After a moment, he spoke with his soft, wise voice. "Haley, I understand your pain. Losing George was a hard blow for all of us, but especially for you. However, you must remember that you are not alone. You have your children, and you have me. And although I can't replace George, I want you to know that I will always be here to help you with whatever you need." Haley felt a lump in her throat as she heard those words. Mr. Tony had been a pillar for her, someone she could trust without reservation. She knew that he, too, had experienced his own share of losses, and the fact that he still found the strength to support her family was a testament to his nobility. "Thank you, Tony," Haley said, her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know how I could go on without your support." Mr. Tony looked at her tenderly. "We are a family, Haley, and family takes care of each other, protects each other, supports each other. You don't have to carry all the weight alone. I'm here to share it with you." Mr. Tony's words filled Haley's heart with comforting warmth. She knew that, although life remained difficult, with people like Mr. Tony by her side, she could face any challenge. His friendship was a reminder that in the midst of difficulties, there was always hope, always light. Finally, Mr. Tony said his goodbyes, leaving Haley with her thoughts. As she watched her children prepare for bed, Haley felt a renewed determination. She knew her path wouldn't be easy, but with the love of her children and Mr. Tony's support, she would keep moving forward. She had learned through the toughest trials that true strength didn't lie in the absence of problems, but in the ability to face them with courage and love. And with that thought, she went to rest, knowing that although the day had been exhausting, she had found a faithful friend in Mr. Tony, a beacon of light in the darkness of her worries. Days later, the sun shone softly over Seattle's park. It was an afternoon like any other, and Haley decided to take her children to play after a long week of work. The park, with its tall trees and fresh air, was one of the few places where they could relax and forget, even if only for a while, the worries that weighed on their shoulders. As the children ran and played, Haley allowed herself to sit on a bench, enjoying the moment of tranquility. She closed her eyes for a moment, listening to her children's laughter, mingled with the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was in these moments that Haley found renewed strength, remembering that despite everything, her family remained united and happy. Will, the eldest of the children, was always the most attentive and protective. While his siblings played, he walked around the park, observing his surroundings with the seriousness that characterized him. At 13, he felt responsible for his mother and siblings, a role he had taken on after his father's death. It was during one of these walks that Will noticed something unusual. On a bench away from the children's bustle, he saw an elderly woman sitting, her head bowed and her shoulders hunched. Her disheveled appearance contrasted with the park's vitality. What caught Will's attention the most was that the elderly woman seemed to be crying silently, her trembling hands covering her face. Moved by compassion, Will approached slowly, unsure of how to act. Though he was little more than a child, his heart was full of empathy and a desire to help others, a quality he had inherited from his mother. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked softly, keeping a respectful distance. The elderly woman looked up, and her tearful eyes met Will's. Her face was marked by the wrinkles of age, but what stood out the most was the deep sadness that seemed to have robbed her of any trace of hope. "Oh boy," she murmured weakly. "I'm fine, don't worry." But Will, in his innocence, knew she wasn't fine. There was something in the way the elderly woman spoke, a sadness that resonated with the pain he himself had felt after losing his father. "Are you sure?" he insisted. "If you need anything, my mom is here. She always knows what to do." The elderly woman looked at the boy with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. In a world where many people passed by without even noticing her existence, this child had taken a moment to ask if she was okay. Her simple gesture deeply moved her. At that moment, Haley, noticing that Will had wandered off, decided to approach. Seeing the scene, she knew something was wrong. She walked over to the bench where the elderly woman was sitting and gave her a warm, understanding smile. "Good afternoon," Haley greeted. "I'm Will's mother. I hope he's not bothering you." "No, not at all," the elderly woman replied, shaking her head. "He's a very sweet boy. I was just a little lost in my thoughts." Haley, always attentive to signs of suffering in others, sat down next to the elderly woman. Something in her instinct told her that this woman needed more than just a simple conversation. "My name is Haley," she introduced herself, extending her hand. "And you? What's your name?" The elderly woman took Haley's hand with a faint smile that seemed difficult to sustain. "I'm Mrs. Santos," she replied. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Haley, and thank you for your concern." The next words came from Mrs. Santos's lips in a torrent of pent-up pain. In a trembling voice, she shared her story. She had dedicated her life to raising her children alone after her husband passed away when they were young. She had worked tirelessly to give them everything they needed, sacrificing her own dreams and desires to ensure they lacked nothing. However, as the years passed, her children grew distant, consumed by their own lives. Now in her old age, she found herself alone and homeless, rejected by those she had given all her love and sacrifice to. Haley listened in silence, feeling each word like a blow to her heart. Mrs. Santos's story resonated with her own life, and she couldn't help but feel a deep empathy for this woman who had been abandoned in her later years. Although Haley herself was struggling to keep her family afloat, she felt an urgent need to help. "I can't imagine what you've been through, Mrs. Santos," Haley said softly, "but I want you to know that you are not alone. If you have nowhere to go, I would like you to come live with us. My home isn't big or luxurious, but it's full of love, and there's always room for one more." Mrs. Santos looked at her astonished. She hadn't expected such kindness from a stranger, especially knowing that Haley herself didn't have much to offer in material terms. But the sincerity in Haley's eyes and the compassion she had felt since Will first approached her deeply moved her. "I don't want to be a burden to you and your children, Haley," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "You won't be," Haley assured her, taking the elderly woman's hands in hers. "My children will be delighted to have you with us, and I will be grateful to have someone to share our lives with." And so, without further thought, Haley made a decision that would change their lives forever. With Mrs. Santos by her side and Will leading the way, they returned home. The children, far from worrying about the new limitations this might entail, welcomed the elderly woman with enthusiasm, seeing her as a grandmother who needed love and care. That night, as everyone settled into their beds, Haley felt an inner peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. She knew that taking in Mrs. Santos wouldn't be easy, but she also knew it was the right thing to do. George had always told her that life could be tough, but that one should always choose to be kind. And Haley was determined to live by those words. With Mrs. Santos in her home, Haley realized that although she had little to offer in terms of material wealth, her true treasure was the love she shared with her children and those she chose to help. And that treasure she thought was more valuable than any fortune. The first days with Mrs. Santos in their home were a mixture of adaptation and discovery. Despite the limited space and resources, Haley realized she had done the right thing by offering her a place in their home. From the moment the elderly woman crossed the threshold, something changed in the atmosphere of the home. The sadness and pain that had accompanied Mrs. Santos began to fade, replaced by a calm and warmth that Haley hadn't anticipated. Mrs. Santos's presence brought with it an air of wisdom and serenity. Though her life had been marked by betrayal and abandonment, the elderly woman hadn't lost her ability to love or her desire to care for others. As she integrated into the family's daily routine, she began to share with them the lessons life had taught her, filling the evenings with stories from her youth and advice that resonated with Haley's experiences. One afternoon, while the children were doing their homework at the kitchen table, Mrs. Santos sat beside them, her kind gaze tenderly observing their efforts to learn. "When I was a child, my mother used to tell me that knowledge is the greatest treasure one can have," the elderly woman said, her voice soft but full of authority. "Because knowledge is something no one can take away from you, and it will always be there to guide you in difficult times." The children listened attentively, fascinated by her words. To them, Mrs. Santos wasn't just a guest in their home. She was becoming a beloved figure, almost like a grandmother whose presence brought comfort and security. Even Will, who was often reserved, began seeking her company, enjoying the stories she shared about times gone by. Mr. Tony, who was already almost a permanent member of the family, also found himself drawn to Mrs. Santos's company. A friendship based on mutual respect and understanding of life's hardships blossomed between them. Mr. Tony, who had lost his wife years earlier, found in Mrs. Santos a companionship that eased his loneliness, and together they spent long hours conversing on the porch while the children played nearby. One evening, as the sun slowly set on the horizon, Mr. Tony and Mrs. Santos sat on the porch, watching the children run around the yard. "It's a gift to be here," Mrs. Santos said, her voice filled with gratitude. "I never imagined I would find a family that would take me in with so much love." Mr. Tony nodded, his eyes shining with an emotion he had learned to control over the years. "Life has mysterious ways of bringing people together," he responded. "I myself felt lost until I met Haley and the children. Now, I feel like I have a purpose again." "It's a special family," Mrs. Santos added. "Haley is an incredibly strong woman. She reminds me of myself when I was young, though I think she's even braver than I was." Mr. Tony smiled at the elderly woman's words. Both of them knew that despite the challenges, they had found a refuge in Haley's family, a place where they could feel valued and loved. Meanwhile, inside the house, Haley was preparing dinner, listening with a smile to the voices coming from the porch. She knew that taking in Mrs. Santos had been a risk, but each passing day showed her that she had made the right decision. The elderly woman hadn't just found a home, she had brought with her a new energy that had transformed their house. The children, who at first had been a bit reluctant to share their space, now competed for Mrs. Santos's attention. Every night before bed, the elderly woman would tell them a story, a tradition that had become the most anticipated moment of the day. Her tales not only entertained the children, but also taught them important lessons about life, perseverance, and love. One of those nights, as Mrs. Santos was recounting a story from her youth, Will sat closer to her, his eyes fixed on hers. "Grandma Santos," he said shyly, "why didn't your children love you anymore?" The question, though innocent, carried an emotional weight that Hailey felt deeply. She knew that Will was trying to understand the pain Mrs. Santos had experienced, perhaps because he himself feared losing his mother in the same way. Mrs. Santos sighed, gently taking Will's hand. "My children were led astray by things that weren't important," she replied, with sadness in her voice. "Money, power, those things can make people forget what really matters in life: love, family, respect. But I don't blame them, Will. I just hope that one day they will understand that they took the wrong path." Will nodded, understanding more than he could express. In that moment, he silently promised that he would always take care of his mother and siblings, no matter what happened in the future. As the weeks passed, Mrs. Santos became an integral part of the family. Though Hailey continued to face financial challenges and the burden of being the sole provider, the elderly woman's presence gave her a new perspective. Hailey began to see her home not just as a place of struggle, but as a sanctuary where people could heal and find comfort. And so Hailey's little refuge, though modest, became a home filled with love, laughter, and shared wisdom. The bonds forged between the family members and Mrs. Santos were stronger than any adversity they faced. Every day, Hailey felt more grateful for the decision she had made, knowing that she had found in Mrs. Santos not just a companion, but also a guide on the difficult path of life. Days passed in Seattle, and Mrs. Santos's presence in Hailey's home had become a natural part of everyday life. However, in a small town like Seattle, news traveled fast, and not everyone understood or approved of Hailey's decision to take in a homeless elderly woman under her roof. Curious glances and murmurs began to follow her wherever she went, like persistent shadows she couldn't ignore. One morning, as Hailey was shopping at the market, she felt the eyes of some neighbors on her. It wasn't unusual for people in Seattle to talk, but this time the comments seemed sharper, more critical. While she was examining fruits at a stall, she overheard two women conversing in low voices, though loud enough for her to hear. "Have you heard what Hailey did?" one of the women said, her tone a mix of disapproval and astonishment. "She took in an old homeless woman. How can she afford it when she barely has enough for her own children?" "Yes, I heard," the other replied, shaking her head. "It's madness. She already has enough problems without adding more. Sometimes I wonder if she's losing her mind." Hailey felt her face flush with shame and restrained anger. She wanted to turn around and tell them that they didn't understand, that they didn't know her life or her reasons, but she knew that arguing with them would only fuel more gossip. So she kept her head held high, gritting her teeth, and finished her shopping in silence. Returning home, she tried to leave behind the hurtful words she had heard, but they replayed in her mind, over and over again. Hailey had always been a strong person, capable of enduring a lot, but the cruelty of the rumors affected her more than she wanted to admit. She knew she was doing the right thing by helping Mrs. Santos, but doubts began to creep into her mind. What if the people were right? What if she really was making a reckless decision that would put her family at risk? That night, as she was preparing dinner, Hailey noticed that Mrs. Santos was watching her with a perceptive gaze, as if she had sensed the internal storm brewing in her heart. "Hailey, dear," the elderly woman said, her voice soft, "you don't seem like yourself today. Has something happened?" Hailey hesitated for a moment, not wanting to worry Mrs. Santos, but the warmth in the elderly woman's eyes made her feel she could trust her. "It's just that people in town have started talking," Hailey admitted, sighing. "They say I shouldn't have taken you in, that I already have enough problems. Sometimes I wonder if they're right, if I'm really doing the right thing." Mrs. Santos took Hailey's hand, squeezing it with surprising strength for someone her age. "Hailey, in my life I've learned that people are always going to talk, especially when they don't understand the hearts of others," she said firmly. "But you and I know the truth. We know that love and compassion are more important than any judgment. Those who criticize do so because they don't have the courage to do what you're doing. Don't let their words make you doubt your goodness." Mrs. Santos's words resonated deeply with Haley. She knew the elderly woman was right, but still, it was hard to ignore the stares and whispers. However, she decided that she wouldn't let the spiteful comments define her actions. Her life hadn't been easy, and the decisions she made weren't always understood by others. But she was sure of one thing. Every step she took, she did for the well-being of her children and to follow the principles George had instilled in her. The next day, as she walked with her children through the streets of the town, Haley once again felt the curious glances of the neighbors. This time, however, she didn't allow herself to falter. She kept moving forward, holding Will's hand firmly, remembering Mrs. Santos's words. She knew she was being watched, judged, but she also knew that her heart was in the right place. In the park, while the children played, one of the town's neighbors, an older woman named Carmen, approached Haley. Carmen was known for her sharp tongue, and Haley mentally prepared herself for what was coming. "I heard you've brought Mrs. Santos to live with you," Carmen said bluntly. Haley nodded, maintaining her composure. "Yes, I did. I couldn't leave her alone with nowhere to stay." Carmen observed her for a moment, as if evaluating the sincerity in Haley's words. Finally, she sighed and nodded. "You're braver than many in this town believe, Haley. Not everyone would be willing to do what you've done. Some may criticize you, but I know your heart is generous. Don't let the empty words of others affect you." Carmen's words surprised Haley, but they also gave her a new sense of encouragement. Knowing that there were people who understood and respected her decisions, even if they were few, gave her the strength to keep going. As the days passed, Haley began to notice that not everyone in town looked at her with disdain. Some neighbors greeted her with a smile, and others even stopped to chat with her, showing interest in Mrs. Santos. Slowly, the compassion Haley had shown began to resonate with those who had initially criticized her. Although not everyone in Seattle accepted her decision, Haley understood that the most important thing was to remain true to her values and her family. At the end of the day, she knew she had done the right thing, and that was all that really mattered. That night, as she closed the windows and prepared the house for bedtime, Haley felt more at peace. The hurtful words of others no longer affected her as they once did. She had decided that her life would not be defined by the opinions of others, but by her own actions and the kindness in her heart. And so, as she snuggled into bed, listening to the soft breathing of her children in the next room, Haley allowed herself to smile. She knew that life would continue to be difficult, but she also knew she had the strength to face it, thanks to the love and support of those who truly mattered. And with that conviction, she fell asleep, ready to face a new day, no matter what people might say. Winter arrived in Seattle with unexpected ferocity. The first snows covered the town with a white blanket, and the temperatures plummeted, making the air feel sharp and icy. For Haley, this winter brought additional challenges that tested her determination and resilience. Haley's house, though filled with love, was far from adequate for the harsh weather ahead. The old walls of the house let the heat escape, and the roof, leaking for months, threatened to make things worse. Haley knew that if she didn't act soon, her family could face a dangerous winter. One morning after the children had gone to school, Haley and Mrs. Santos stayed in the kitchen, watching as the winter wind made the windows creak. Haley, worried, couldn't help but express her fears. "This winter will be tough, Mrs. Santos," she said, stirring a pot of soup. "The house needs urgent repairs, but I don't have the money to do it. The bills are piling up, and I don't know how I'm going to keep us all warm." Mrs. Santos, who had seen many difficult winters in her life, nodded understandingly. She knew the situation was serious, but she also knew Haley's strength. "I understand your concerns, Haley," she responded in her calm voice, "but you're not alone in this. We'll find a way to get through it, as we always have." Haley smiled weakly, grateful for the elderly woman's unwavering support, but the weight of responsibilities continued to crush her. She knew that with each day that passed without fixing the roof and without a properly functioning boiler, she was putting her children at greater risk. Moreover, the heating bills were exorbitant, and she had already had to choose between paying those bills or buying enough food for everyone. That afternoon, Haley decided to do something she usually avoided. She asked for help. She headed to Mr. Johnson's office, knowing that he was an understanding man, though also aware that she didn't like relying on others' charity. When she arrived at the imposing mansion, she was met with the usual coldness of Mr. Emilio, who looked at her with disdain as he led her to Mr. Johnson's office. "Don't worry, Mr. Emilio. I won't take much of the gentleman's time," Haley said, trying to ease the tension. "Make it quick, Haley," Mr. Emilio replied dryly. "The gentleman has important matters to attend to." Mr. Johnson, seeing her enter, greeted her with a genuine smile. "Haley, what a surprise to see you here at this hour," he said, standing up from his desk. "How are you? And how is your family?" Haley took a deep breath before responding. It wasn't easy for her to talk about her difficulties, but she knew she had to do it for the sake of her children. "Mr. Johnson, I'm afraid I'm going through a tough time," she began, feeling her throat tighten. "This winter has been especially hard, and the house needs urgent repairs. The roof is leaking, the boiler is failing, and I fear for my children's safety. I don't usually ask for favors, but I'm wondering if you could advance me part of my salary for the coming month so I can fix it." Mr. Johnson listened attentively, his face reflecting empathy and understanding. Haley was one of the most dedicated employees he had, and he knew she wouldn't ask for help unless it was absolutely necessary. "Haley, I appreciate you coming to talk to me," he said after a moment of reflection. "I know your situation isn't easy, and I admire how you've handled everything. I don't want you to worry about a salary advance. I'll offer you an interest-free loan so you can make the necessary repairs. You can pay it back at your own pace whenever you're able." Haley felt a wave of relief mixed with gratitude. She hadn't expected such a generous response, and for a moment, she felt tears well up in her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice full of emotion. "This means so much to me and my children." "You don't have to thank me, Haley. You deserve it," Mr. Johnson replied with a warm smile. "And if you need anything else, don't hesitate to ask." On her way home, Haley felt lighter. Although she still had a long way to go, she knew she now had the means to make the necessary repairs. When she arrived, she shared the good news with Mrs. Santos, who hugged her tenderly. "I knew you'd find a solution," the elderly woman said. "You always do." In the days that followed, Haley hired a repair team to fix the roof and the boiler. Although the costs were high, she knew it was a necessary investment for her family's safety. Seeing the workers in her home making improvements gave her a renewed sense of hope. For the first time in weeks, she was able to relax a little, knowing that her children would be safe from the winter cold. However, winter brought not only material challenges, but emotional ones as well. With the isolation imposed by the weather, the house filled with tensions that sometimes seemed difficult to manage. The children, accustomed to playing outside, now found themselves confined to closed spaces, leading to small disputes and moments of frustration. Haley did her best to keep the peace, organizing games and activities indoors, but some nights she went to bed exhausted, feeling that the pressure was too great. In those moments, Mrs. Santos became an even more essential pillar. With her calm and wisdom, she helped the children understand the importance of patience and mutual respect, and offered Haley words of comfort and encouragement. Even Mr. Tony, who couldn't visit as often due to the weather, sent messages with small notes of support, reminding Haley that she wasn't alone in her struggle. As winter progressed, Haley faced each day with renewed determination. She knew she had done the right thing by asking for help, and although the challenges remained, so did the strength she had found within herself and in those around her. The winter was harsh, but Haley held on to the hope that with each step, she was a little closer to overcoming the difficulties. And so, in the midst of snow and cold, Haley's home remained warm, not just from the fire of the repaired boiler, but from the love and solidarity shared by all under her roof. Winter continued to advance, and with it, life in Haley's home carried on. However, not all the challenges the family faced were material. As the days passed, Haley began to notice a change in Mrs. Santos's health. The elderly woman, who had always been active and full of energy despite her age, now showed signs of exhaustion. Her steps were slower, and her moments of rest became longer and more frequent. At first, Haley thought the winter cold was affecting Mrs. Santos, but she soon realized it was something more. The elderly woman, always so attentive to the needs of others, tried to hide her discomfort so as not to worry the family. But Haley, with her maternal instinct, couldn't help but feel a growing concern for her friend. The night everything changed, a snowstorm hit the town with unusual fury. The winds howled around the house and the cold seeped through even the blankets and warm clothing. Haley couldn't sleep. Something in the air kept her restless, a feeling that something terrible was about to happen. She got out of bed, her heart beating rapidly, and walked barefoot down the dark hallway to Mrs. Santos's room. When she opened the door, she was met with a silence that chilled her to the bone. The room was in semi-darkness, illuminated only by the flickering light of the fire struggling to stay alive in the fireplace. Mrs. Santos's figure was barely visible under the blankets, her breathing so weak that Haley had to get closer to make sure she was still alive. "Mrs. Santos," Haley whispered, her voice breaking with anguish. The elderly woman slowly opened her eyes as if the simple act required immense effort. Her lips trembled as she tried to form words, but Haley saw in her gaze that there was no turning back. The end was near, closer than she had feared. "Haley, my dear," Mrs. Santos murmured, her voice barely audible over the wind howling outside. Haley knelt by the bed, taking the elderly woman's cold hands in hers. Fear and pain took hold of her, and tears began to stream down her face uncontrollably. She wasn't ready for this. She wasn't ready to lose another person she had come to love. "Please don't leave me," Haley pleaded, her voice broken by sobs. "Don't go. We need you. I need you." Mrs. Santos looked at her with infinite sadness, but also with a peace that Haley couldn't understand. She had lived a long life, had loved and lost, and now she was ready to rest. "Everything will be fine, Haley," the elderly woman said, her voice stronger than Haley expected. "You are a strong woman, stronger than you think. Never forget that the love you give is what will keep you alive, even when I'm no longer here." Haley sobbed, embracing Mrs. Santos, wishing she could hold on to her and never let her go. But she knew, deep down, that she couldn't stop the inevitable. "Promise me that you'll keep going and that you'll take care of your children, just as you've done until now," Mrs. Santos asked, her voice growing weaker. I promise," Haley replied, her heart breaking. Mrs. Santos closed her eyes and her breathing became slower and slower until it finally stopped, taking with it the last breath of life. Haley remained motionless, holding the lifeless body of the elderly woman, while the pain hit her like an unstoppable wave. The room, which had once been a refuge of warmth and wisdom, now felt empty, desolate. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours, before Haley could bring herself to stand up. With mechanical movements, she covered Mrs. Santos's body with the blankets, her hands trembling. She knew she had to be strong, that she had to be the pillar for her children, but at that moment, she felt more alone than ever. As she left the room, Haley was met by Will, who was standing in the hallway, his face pale and full of worry. He had heard his mother's cries, and something inside him told him that something terrible had happened. "Mama," Will asked in a trembling voice, "what happened?" Haley looked at him, and seeing the fear in her son's eyes, something inside her completely broke. She hugged him tightly, collapsing to the floor beside him, and the two cried together, sharing the pain of a loss they couldn't put into words. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions. Mrs. Santos's funeral was small, but full of sorrow. The snow continued to fall, covering the elderly woman's grave like a blanket of farewell. Haley, wrapped in a coat borrowed from Mr. Tony, felt more vulnerable than ever. Every word spoken in honor of Mrs. Santos was a reminder of what she had lost, and the weight of sadness crushed her. Mr. Tony, visibly affected, spoke a few words at the grave, his voice breaking several times. He had lost a dear friend, and the sadness in his eyes was a reflection of the pain shared by everyone present. But there was also a determination in his gaze, a silent promise to be there for Haley and the children, to not let them face this pain alone. That night, after all the visitors had left, Haley sat by the fireplace with the letter Mrs. Santos had left for her. Her hands trembled as she opened it, fearing the words she would find inside. The letter was short, but each word was filled with love and wisdom. Dearest Haley, if you're reading this, it's because my time in this world has come to an end. Don't cry for me, because I've found peace in the love you gave to me and your children. You've been like a daughter to me, a friend, and my greatest comfort in these final days. Never forget that your strength doesn't lie in not feeling pain, but in the ability to keep going despite it. Keep loving, keep fighting, and remember that I'm with you in every decision you make, in every step you take. Take care of your children and above all, take care of yourself. The love you carry within you is a beacon that will light even the darkest days. With all my love, Santos. Tears flowed freely as Haley read the letter, feeling the weight of Mrs. Santos's absence like never before. But along with the pain, she also felt a spark of renewed strength. She knew the elderly woman was right. Her love and strength were the most powerful weapons she had to face the world. With the letter pressed against her chest, Haley looked at the fire, watching the flames dance and slowly consume themselves. She silently promised that she would honor Mrs. Santos's memory, that she would keep going, not just for herself, but for her children, and for the woman who had changed her life in such a short time. And so, in the midst of the darkness and cold of winter, Haley found a new source of warmth in her heart, a flame that, though small, would continue to burn to guide her in the days to come. A few days after the funeral, while cleaning Mrs. Santos's room, Haley found something that would change her life in an unexpected way. In a small drawer of the nightstand, hidden under a lace handkerchief, she found a yellow envelope with her name written on it in careful handwriting. Haley picked it up with trembling hands, immediately recognizing the elderly woman's handwriting. Upon opening the envelope, she found a small key and a folded piece of paper. Her heart began to race as she unfolded the paper, knowing that the words she was about to read had been written by Mrs. Santos in her final days. The message, though brief, was filled with mystery and emotion. "Haley, this key is for you. Open the wooden box I kept in the closet. Inside, you'll find something I wish to leave you as a token of gratitude for all you've done for me. I hope it helps ease some of your worries. With loves, Santos." Haley felt a mix of curiosity and apprehension. What could Mrs. Santos have left for her? Without wasting time, she went to the closet and, after rummaging through the carefully folded blankets and clothes, found a small wooden box, carved with delicate floral designs. Just seeing it gave her a pang of emotion, as if she somehow already knew that what it contained was going to change her life. With trembling hands, Haley used the key to open the box. When she lifted the lid, she saw something that took her breath away. Inside, carefully wrapped in a silk cloth, were several antique pieces of jewelry. They were beautiful pieces, some with precious stones that sparkled in the dim light of the room. Necklaces, rings, bracelets, all of a beauty that Haley had never seen up close. But next to the jewelry was something else, a letter, written on the same soft paper and in the same elegant handwriting as Mrs. Santos. Haley carefully took it and began to read, her heart pounding. "Dear Haley, if you're reading this, it's because I'm no longer by your side. I know that my departure has caused you pain, but I want you to know that I found immense peace in the last days I spent with you and your children. I will never be able to thank you enough for the love and care you offered me, but I hope this small legacy can help relieve some of the burdens you've been carrying. These jewels are all that I was able to keep from a life that, in the end, taught me that true value doesn't lie in material things, but in the bonds we forge with others. I leave them to you, not only as a help, but as a reminder that you deserve the best in this life. Use what you find in this box to take care of your family, to repair your home, to fulfill the dreams you and George had. My dear Haley, don't let life make you forget how strong and valuable you are. Keep going, with your head held high, and remember that although I'm no longer physically with you, I will always be in your heart. Thank you for your kindness. Santos." Haley finished reading the letter with tears streaming down her cheeks. Mrs. Santos's words touched her deeply, filling her with a mixture of sadness, gratitude, and a renewed sense of purpose. She knew that the elderly woman had gone through many trials in her life, and that she had decided to leave this final gift as an ultimate act of love and generosity. For a long time, Haley sat beside the box, looking at the jewels, but thinking of the woman who had left them for her. This legacy was not just a financial relief, It was a symbol of the trust and love that Mrs. Santos had placed in her. Haley felt that in some way the elderly woman was passing the torch to her, trusting that she would know how to carry it forward. With her heart filled with new determination, Haley began to plan how to use the gift Mrs. Santos had left her. The jewels, though valuable, would not be sold lightly. Haley knew she had to use them in a way that honored the elderly woman's memory, ensuring that every decision she made reflected the values that Mrs. Santos had instilled in her. The days that followed were filled with action. Haley used part of the money to pay off the debts that had been accumulating, relieving a burden that had weighed on her for so long. She was also able to make the necessary repairs to the house, ensuring that her children had a safe and warm home during the winter. And finally, she decided to fulfill one of the dreams that George and she had always had, taking their children to see the sea. The days passed quickly after Haley used Mrs. Santos's legacy to put her life in order. She had paid off the debts, ensured the necessary repairs to the house, and finally, the moment she had been eagerly awaiting arrived, planning the trip to the sea with her children. For Haley, this wasn't just a trip, it was a promise fulfilled, a dream that she and George had always shared. From the dawn of the day she decided to announce the trip, Haley's home was filled with an energy that hadn't been felt in a long time. The children, with bright eyes and wide smiles, couldn't contain their excitement. "Are we really going to the sea, Mom?" Elena, the youngest, asked, her voice trembling with excitement. Haley nodded, her heart filling with joy at seeing the anticipation on her children's faces. "Yes, sweetheart. We're going to see the sea, feel the sand under our feet, and listen to the waves crash on the shore. It's going to be an adventure we'll remember forever." The preparation for the trip became a family event in itself. Haley made a list of everything they would need: light clothing, towels, sunscreen, and of course, a basket of food she would prepare herself. While they packed, the children helped each other, excitedly discussing what they would do at the beach. For them, it was like preparing for an expedition to a new and unknown world. Will, with his usual sense of responsibility, made sure everything was in order. He checked that each of his siblings had everything they needed and helped his mother load the bags into the car they had rented for the trip. Haley watched her eldest son with pride, recognizing how much he had grown over the past few years. Despite his youth, he had taken on a protective and leadership role that moved her deeply. Finally, the day of the trip arrived. They got up early before dawn and set out on their journey to the sea. As she drove, Haley felt a mix of excitement and nostalgia. This trip symbolized much more than just a vacation. It was a step towards healing, a tribute to George, and a way to close a painful chapter of their lives while opening a new one filled with hope. The journey itself was peaceful, with the children marveling at the changing landscape as they approached the coast. The mountains and fields gave way to flatter lands, and gradually the scent of salt began to fill the air. The children's eyes widened when they finally caught sight of the vast ocean stretching out before them. "Mom, it's huge," Javier exclaimed in awe. "I never imagined the sea would be so big." Haley smiled, touched by her children's innocence and wonder. She parked the car near the beach, and together they hurried out onto the sand. At the first touch of the soft sand under their feet, the children let out shouts of joy, running towards the water with a freedom that only children know. The sound of their laughter filled the air, and Haley stayed back for a moment, watching them, feeling a deep peace beginning to settle in her heart. Walking toward the sea was an act of liberation for Haley. Feeling the cold, damp sand beneath her feet connected her to the earth in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. The salty wind caressed her face, and the rhythmic sound of the waves crashing on the shore enveloped her like an eternal melody that resonated deep within her soul. The children ran toward the water, jumping between the waves and splashing with contagious joy. Even Will, usually so serious, allowed himself to be carried away by the moment, laughing alongside his siblings as the water surrounded them. Seeing her children so happy filled Haley's chest with a love as vast as the ocean itself. She knew in that instant that everything she had done, every sacrifice and every difficult decision, had been worth it. After a while, Haley joined them at the shore. The water was cold, but the sensation was revitalizing, as if the ocean itself was washing away the worries and pain she had accumulated for so long. Together, They collected shells, built sandcastles, and marveled at the marine life they found in the tide pools among the rocks. As the children played, Haley sat on the sand, letting the waves lap at her feet. She gazed out at the horizon, where the sky and sea met in an infinite line. It was in that moment that a deep reflection enveloped her, a connection to everything she had lived through and all that still lay ahead. She closed her eyes and allowed her mind to wander. She thought of George, of the life they had planned together, and of everything he had meant to her. She felt his absence like a wound that would never fully heal, but she also felt his presence as if he were there watching the sea with her. She thought of Mrs. Santos, of her wisdom and the love she had shared with them in her final days. Despite the sadness of her passing, Haley understood that the elderly woman had been a gift in her life, a beacon of light in a moment of darkness. Her words and her legacy would continue to guide her, helping her be the mother, the woman, and the person she had always aspired to be. The sea, with its vastness and power, reminded Haley of the greatness of life itself. Despite the ups and downs, despite the storms, there was always a new dawn, a new opportunity to start again. Sitting there with the sound of the ocean as a constant murmur, Haley made peace with her past and committed to embracing the future with the same strength and determination she had shown thus far. She realized that, although the journey had been hard, she had reached a place of peace. Her family was safe, her children were happy, and although life would continue to present challenges, she knew she had the capacity to face them with courage and love. The sea, with its eternal ebb and flow, taught her that life is a cycle, that the waves of pain and joy come and go, but there is always beauty in the balance of both. When the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Haley stood up, gathering her children around her. They held hands and walked together along the shore, their footprints marking the wet sand. The children were exhausted but happy, and Haley felt that for the first time in a long time, everything was right. Before returning to the car, Haley stopped one last time to look at the sea. She closed her eyes and let the wind play with her hair, feeling in her heart the presence of George and Mrs. Santos, as if both were there, watching her, supporting her in this new chapter of her life. "Thank you," she whispered to the wind, her voice filled with gratitude and love. "Thank you for everything." With that simple word, Haley released all the pain of the past, carrying with her only the memories and love that had made her stronger. She walked toward the car with her children, knowing that although life would continue to be a journey full of surprises, she was ready to face it, with her heart full of hope and the certainty that, no matter what happened, she would always have the power to find peace within herself. The trip to the sea was not just an adventure for her children, it was a rebirth for Haley, a reaffirmation of life, love, and the courage that had sustained her until now. And as the car drove away from the beach, leaving behind the vast expanse of water, Haley knew she carried with her something far more valuable, the assurance that with love and determination, she would always find her way, no matter how difficult the journey. In the hustle and complexities of everyday life, it's easy to lose sight of what truly matters. We become immersed in our own worries, struggle with our own burdens, and sometimes forget that the simplest act of kindness can have a profound impact, not only on the life of the person we help, but also on our own. Haley's story teaches us a universal truth: helping others, even when we ourselves are going through difficulties, is an act of love that transcends the material and the immediate. When Haley decided to open the doors of her home to Mrs. Santos, she did so out of compassion and the desire to ease the suffering of someone in need. She expected nothing in return. She acted from the heart. However, what she received in return was far more valuable than any material reward. By helping Mrs. Santos, Haley not only transformed the elderly woman's life, but also changed her own and that of her family. Helping others is an act that may seem small, but it has the power to spark deep and lasting change. It connects us to our humanity, reminds us that we are not alone in this world, and allows us to experience a satisfaction that no material wealth can match. By extending a hand to someone in need, we are not only offering our support, we are also opening our hearts to receive something invaluable, the joy of having made a difference in someone else's life. Because in this world, where difficulties are inevitable, it is love and mutual support that sustain us, uplift us, and give us the strength to keep going. And that, without a doubt, is the greatest reward of all. Thank you for joining us in this video. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming content. See you in the next video. Until next time.